James Bennett drove home with a smile on his face. His business trip had ended 2 days early, and he couldn't wait to surprise Lisa. After 5 years of marriage, he still loved coming home to her. The familiar streets of their quiet neighborhood welcomed him back as evening shadows grew longer. He parked in the driveway instead of the garage, wanting to keep his arrival quiet. Their 2-story house looked the same as always, but something felt off as he approached the front door. The curtains were drawn tight. Lisa usually kept them open until sunset. Using his key, James entered quietly. The living room lights were dimmed and a half-empty wine glass sat on the coffee table next to one of Lisa's medical journals. The house smelled different, a hint of cologne he didn't recognize mixed with the scent of food he couldn't place. "Lisa," he called out, setting down his luggage. "I'm home early." A crash came from upstairs, followed by hurried footsteps. Moments later, Lisa appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed and her blonde hair messier than she typically allowed. "James? Oh my God, you scared me." She rushed down and hugged him tightly, but her body felt tense against his. "Why didn't you call first?" He kissed her, noticing her distracted glance toward the basement door. "Wanted to surprise you. Everything okay?" "Of course." Lisa's smile came too quickly. "Just tired from work. The hospital was crazy today." She took his hand, pulling him toward the kitchen. "Are you hungry? I can heat up some pasta from yesterday." While Lisa busied herself with food, James noticed 2 plates in the sink. Had she had company? He wasn't the jealous type, but the nervous energy radiating from his normally calm wife was unsettling. "I'll just freshen up first," he said, heading toward their downstairs bathroom. "Use the upstairs one," Lisa called out too loudly. "This one's. The sink is clogged." James nodded but changed direction once she returned to the kitchen. The basement door was slightly ajar. Unusual, as Lisa hated the unfinished space and rarely went down there. Curiosity pushed him forward. He opened the door quietly and descended the creaky wooden steps. The bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Their old furniture and boxes lined the walls, but something new caught his eye. A makeshift bed made from their old couch cushions, a pillow, and a blanket he didn't recognize. Beside it sat a plate with food scraps and a water bottle. On a nearby box were men's clothes, definitely not his. Someone was living in their basement. His heart racing, James examined the space further. A backpack partially hidden behind a storage bin contained toiletries and a worn paperback novel. No weapons, thankfully, but a newspaper with certain articles circled in red pen made his stomach drop. "What are you doing down here?" Lisa's voice from the stairs made him jump. Her face was pale, hands gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. "I think I should be asking you that question," James replied, gesturing to the makeshift bed. "Who's staying in our basement, Lisa?" She closed her eyes briefly, tears forming at the corners. "James, I can explain." "Is there someone else, Lisa? Are you?" "No. God, no, it's nothing like that," she insisted, coming closer. "It's complicated. He needed a place to stay, and I couldn't say no." "He?" James felt his temper rising. "Who is he and why is he hiding in our house?" Lisa took a shaky breath, placing her hand on James's arm. "He's an old friend who's in trouble. Real trouble, James. I promised I wouldn't tell anyone he's here, not even you." "That's not how marriage works," James said, his voice low. "Whatever's going on, you should have told me." A soft noise from above made them both look up. Lisa's hand tightened on his arm. "Please don't call the police. I swear I'll explain everything, but not right now." That night, James lay awake beside his wife, watching her pretend to sleep. The distance between them in their bed felt like miles. Who was this man hiding in their home? And more troubling, what kind of hold did he have on Lisa that she would risk their marriage to protect him? The morning sun filtered through the bedroom curtains, waking James from his troubled sleep. Lisa's side of the bed was empty and cold. He lay there for a moment, hoping yesterday had been a bad dream. But the muffled voices downstairs confirmed it wasn't. James dressed quickly in jeans and a t-shirt. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Lisa's soft laugh drifted up from the kitchen, a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. His stomach tightened. Taking a deep breath, he descended the stairs. The voices stopped as he entered the kitchen. Lisa stood by the stove in her silk robe, hair pulled back in a messy bun. Across from her at their small table sat a man James had never seen before. The stranger stood up when James entered. He was tall with broad shoulders and dark hair cut short. A few days of stubble covered his strong jaw, and his intense blue eyes assessed James carefully. Despite the casual clothes, something about his posture suggested military or law enforcement training. "James," Lisa said, her voice unnaturally bright. "This is Mark Wilson. Mark, this is my husband James." Mark extended his hand. "Thanks for not calling the cops last night," he said in a deep voice. His firm handshake lasted a second too long, as if testing James. James nodded stiffly. "Don't thank me yet. I still don't know what's going on." Lisa placed a cup of coffee in front of James's usual seat. "Sit down." Mark was just explaining everything. James sat, noticing the easy way Lisa touched Mark's shoulder as she moved past him. It wasn't romantic exactly, but there was a comfort there that suggested history. "How do you two know each other?" James asked, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Mark glanced at Lisa before answering. "We were close in college, same political science program." "Close?" James repeated, looking at Lisa. She busied herself with breakfast. "We dated for a while." Mark smiled slightly. 3 years isn't a while, Lisa?" The casual use of his wife's name, the shared memory. James felt like an outsider in his own home. "And now you're what, exactly? On the run?" "Something like that," Mark said. "I uncovered some things I shouldn't have. People with power want me quiet." Mark was working undercover. Lisa explained, placing plates of eggs and toast on the table. He found corruption linking Marshall Pharmaceuticals to several government officials. When he tried to report it through proper channels, someone leaked his identity. James frowned. Marshall was one of his company's biggest clients. "You have proof of this?" "Enough to make them nervous," Mark said. "Not enough to keep me safe yet." Lisa sat beside James, her knee touching his under the table. "He has nowhere else to go, James. These people have connections everywhere." James watched as Mark took a bite of toast. The man moved with controlled precision, his eyes constantly tracking between them and the windows. There was something magnetic about him, dangerous but compelling. "How long?" James asked. "A few days," Lisa said quickly, "just until this contact can arrange safe passage." Mark's eyes met James's. "I'll pull my weight around here. And I'll be gone before I bring trouble to your door." James didn't miss the way Lisa's expression fell slightly at those words. Something twisted in his chest, not just jealousy, but a more complex emotion he couldn't name. "Fine," James said finally, "but no more secrets, Lisa. And Mark, you stay in the basement when we have visitors." After breakfast, Lisa went upstairs to shower. James watched Mark washing dishes, something Lisa usually had to nag him to do. The man's t-shirt stretched across his back as he moved, revealing a hint of a scar near his shoulder. "You still love her," James said suddenly, surprised by his own words. Mark didn't turn around. "She made her choice a long time ago. She loves you." "But you came to her when you were in trouble." Mark placed the last dish on the rack and turned, leaning against the counter. "I didn't know where else to go." His eyes met James's with unexpected honesty. "She talks about you all the time, says you're a good man." James felt strangely flattered by this. "How long have you been in my basement?" 5 days. James nodded, processing this information. 5 days of his wife keeping this secret. 5 days of this man watching their home, learning their routines. 5 days of Lisa carrying this burden alone. "Don't hurt her," James said finally, standing up. "Whatever happens with your situation, don't hurt her." Mark's expression softened slightly. "That's the last thing I want." As James left the kitchen, he realized that the danger in his house might not just be from whoever was hunting Mark, but from the complicated feelings awakening in all 3 of them. 3 days passed with Mark living in their house. James called his office and said he needed to work from home for a while. He set up his laptop at the dining room table, where he could keep an eye on both the front door and the interactions between Lisa and Mark. The tension in the house grew thicker each day. James caught Lisa staring at Mark when she thought no one was looking, but more confusing was how James found himself watching Mark too, observing his confident movements, the way his eyes softened when he spoke about his work, the deep laugh that sometimes escaped when Lisa said something funny. "We need groceries." Lisa announced that afternoon, keys already in hand. Anything special you want for dinner? Get some beer, Mark said, looking up from the newspaper he was reading. When James raised an eyebrow, Mark added, I'll pay you back someday. After Lisa left, an awkward silence filled the room. James tried to focus on his work emails, but he could feel Mark's eyes on him. Your company does business with Marshall Pharmaceuticals, Mark said finally. James looked up sharply. How do you know that? Mark nodded toward James's laptop. Saw their logo on your screen yesterday. They're a client, James admitted. I handle their international shipping contracts. Mark stood up and walked to the window, checking the street before turning back to James. Did you know they've been shipping unregistered drugs to testing facilities in Eastern Europe? That's not possible, James said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. There are regulations, inspections. Mark's mouth twisted into a grim smile. Money buys a lot of blind eyes. Is that what got you in trouble? Discovering their illegal shipments. Mark moved closer, sitting across from James at the table. Partly. But it's bigger than that. The CEO, Robert Marshall, has senators in his pocket. They're pushing legislation to bypass FDA approval for certain experimental treatments. People are dying in those trials, James. Something in Mark's intensity made James's heart beat faster. You have proof. Some. Not enough. Mark hesitated, then leaned forward. But I know their shipping schedules. The routes. The people involved. James's throat went dry. You want my help? I wasn't going to ask, Mark said quietly. But since you brought it up, yes. Their eyes locked, and James felt something shift between them. This wasn't just about Lisa anymore. I'd be risking my job, James said. Maybe more. Mark nodded. I know. Before James could respond, the front door opened. Lisa walked in with grocery bags, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stopped when she saw them sitting so close together. Everything okay? She asked, looking between them. Mark stood first, breaking the moment, just getting to know each other better. That evening after dinner, James found Lisa in their bedroom, changing clothes. Her blouse dropped to the floor, revealing the curve of her back. He closed the door behind him. You never told me Mark was your college boyfriend, he said. Lisa turned, reaching for her nightshirt. Would you have let him stay if I had? I don't know. James moved closer. Were you in love with him? Her hands paused at the buttons of her shirt. It was a long time ago, James. That's not an answer. Lisa sighed. Yes, I was in love with him. And now? Her eyes met his. Now I'm married to you. James reached out, brushing hair from her face. That's still not an answer. Lisa's breath caught. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth, James whispered. I see how you look at him, James. And I see how he looks at you, James continued. And sometimes, how he looks at me. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. What are you saying? James wasn't sure himself. The feelings swirling inside him were confusing, exciting, frightening. I don't know. Everything feels different since he arrived. He'll be gone soon, Lisa said, but there was sadness in her voice. James pulled her closer. Is that what you want? Instead of answering, Lisa kissed him, harder and more passionately than she had in months. James responded, backing her toward their bed. As they fell onto it together, he couldn't help wondering if her sudden passion was because of their conversation about Mark. More surprising was his realization that the thought didn't bother him as much as it should. When Lisa called out his name later, arching beneath him, James caught a movement by their partially open door, Mark's shadow, retreating silently down the hall. James said nothing, just held Lisa closer, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never considered before. James found himself unable to sleep again. The clock by his bed showed 2:17 a.m. Lisa lay beside him, her breathing soft and even. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and headed downstairs for water. The kitchen light was on. Mark sat at the table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, papers spread before him. He looked up as James entered, quickly gathering the papers. Can't sleep either? Mark asked. James shook his head, getting a glass from the cabinet. Too much on my mind. Sorry about that, Mark said quietly. I never meant to disrupt your life. Instead of heading back upstairs, James sat across from Mark. What were you looking at? Mark hesitated, then spread the papers again. Shipping manifests from Marshall Pharmaceuticals. Routes, dates, contact information. James leaned forward. Where did you get these? I have my sources, Mark said with a slight smile. Still have a few friends willing to risk their necks. They sat in silence for a moment. Then James asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why did you and Lisa break up back then? Mark's eyes darkened. He took a long sip of whiskey before answering. I joined the agency right after graduation. Deep cover work. Couldn't tell her anything about it. She thought you abandoned her. I did, Mark admitted, for her safety. The truth hung between them in the quiet kitchen. James thought about how different his life might have been if Mark had stayed with Lisa. I found some of her old college photos, James said. You were in a lot of them. Mark smiled. We were inseparable for 3 years. She never mentioned you. Not once in 5 years of marriage. Mark's fingers tightened around his glass. Some things hurt too much to talk about. James poured himself some whiskey from the bottle on the table. What happens when this is over, when you're not a wanted man anymore? I disappear again, Mark said, his voice low. Find a new identity, a new life. Their eyes met across the table. James felt something unspoken pass between them. A recognition of shared feelings neither man was ready to name. You don't have to, James heard himself say. Mark's expression shifted, surprise and something else flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? James wasn't sure himself. The whiskey warmed his blood, made him bolder. I could help you. With the Marshall evidence, my company access might be useful. That would put you at risk. I'm already at risk with you in my house, James said, but without anger. Mark leaned forward, close enough that James could smell his cologne mixed with whiskey. Why would you help me? Before James could answer, a car drove slowly past their house, headlights sweeping across the kitchen windows. Mark tensed, immediately alert. He moved to the window, staying to one side as he peered out. Black sedan, he said. Second time tonight. James joined him at the window, their shoulders touching as they watched the car disappear around the corner. You think they found you? Maybe? Mark's face was grim. I should leave. I'm putting you both in danger. James found himself gripping Mark's arm. Not tonight, it's too risky if they're watching the house. Mark looked down at James's hand on his arm, then back to his face. You're not what I expected, James Bennett. What did you expect? I thought you'd be easier to hate, Mark said with brutal honesty. James didn't let go of Mark's arm. Because of Lisa. Because of everything. Mark's voice dropped lower. I came here thinking only of her. Now. He didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes said enough. James felt heat rising in his face, his heart pounding against his ribs. The tension between them had shifted into something neither had anticipated. We should get some sleep, James said finally, releasing Mark's arm. Figure things out tomorrow. Mark nodded, gathering his papers. As they walked toward the stairs, James to his bedroom and Mark to the basement, their steps slowed. James, Mark said softly. Thank you. Not many men would handle this situation with such understanding. James looked at him for a long moment. Maybe I'm just beginning to understand. Their eyes held a moment longer before James turned and climbed the stairs, his mind even more confused than before. As he slipped back into bed beside Lisa, she stirred and curled against him. Everything okay? She murmured sleepily. Just getting water, he whispered, holding her close, aware that his feelings for his wife remained as strong as ever, even as new feelings for Mark bloomed alongside them, changing everything. The storm hit unexpectedly the next evening. Rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. James was helping Lisa prepare dinner when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Perfect timing, Lisa muttered, setting down her knife. I think we have candles in the drawer by the fridge. Mark appeared in the doorway, his tall frame a shadow against the darkness. I'll check the breakers. It's the storm, James said, feeling his way to the drawer. Power's probably out on the whole block. His hand brushed against Lisa's as they both reached for the candles. Even after 5 years of marriage, her touch still sent warmth through him. He found the matches and soon the kitchen glowed with soft candlelight. Mark returned with a battery-powered lantern from his backpack. Always prepared, he said with a slight smile. They finished making dinner, a simple pasta dish, and brought everything to the living room, where they sat on the floor around the coffee table. Lisa opened a bottle of red wine. Like a picnic, she said, pouring 3 glasses. The candlelight cast strange shadows on their faces, making this ordinary moment feel charged with possibility. James watched as Lisa handed Mark his glass, their fingers touching longer than necessary. To unexpected situations, Mark said, raising his glass. They drank in silence, the wine warming them against the chill that crept into the house without heating. After dinner, Lisa brought out more candles, placing them around the room. The storm raged outside, but inside their small circle of light, time seemed suspended. I need to tell you both something, Lisa said suddenly, setting down her second glass of wine. I've been keeping secrets, and I'm tired of it. James and Mark both turned to her, waiting. When Mark showed up at our door, bleeding and desperate, I told myself I was helping him because it was the right thing to do. She took a deep breath, but that wasn't the whole truth. Mark reached for her hand. Lisa, you don't have to. I do, she insisted. James deserves the truth. She looked at her husband with glistening eyes. When Mark disappeared from my life 10 years ago, it broke me. I never got closure, never understood why. James nodded, encouraging her to continue. Then I met you, James, and you healed parts of me I thought would always be broken. I love you, I need you to know that. I know, James said quietly. Lisa's eyes moved between the two men, but seeing Mark again, those old feelings came back, and I've been so confused. The confession hung in the air between them. James waited for the jealousy to hit him, but instead found himself oddly relieved at her honesty. There's more, Mark said, his deep voice almost a whisper. He looked at James. This isn't just about Lisa and me. Something's changed here, between all of us. James felt his heart racing. The wine, the candlelight, the storm isolating them from the world. Everything conspired to make this moment feel destined. I came here thinking only of Lisa, Mark continued. But these past days, he looked at James directly. I never expected to feel something for you too. The room grew very still. Lisa's eyes widened as she looked between them, understanding dawning on her face. James, she questioned softly. James took a long drink of his wine, buying time to find the right words. I don't know what this is, he admitted, but I feel it too. With both of you. The confession left him feeling vulnerable yet strangely liberated. Lisa moved closer to him, taking his hand. I thought I was going crazy, she said, feeling this way about both of you. Mark set down his glass and moved closer, completing their circle. What happens now? The question hung between them, full of possibility. Outside, the storm lashed against the windows, as if reflecting the tumult of emotions in the room. James looked at his wife, then at Mark. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think we should find out. Lisa's hand tightened around his. With her other hand, she reached for Mark. Are we really considering this? She asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Instead of answering, Mark leaned forward and gently kissed her. James watched, surprised by the wave of desire that washed over him at the sight. When Mark pulled back, he turned to James, question in his eyes. James answered by closing the distance between them, their lips meeting in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened. Lisa's soft gasp brought them back to awareness of her presence. In the flickering candlelight, 3 people who had been circling each other for days finally acknowledged the truth of what they all wanted: consequences be damned. The morning light crept through the curtains, waking James from a deep sleep. For a moment he was disoriented, surprised to find Lisa curled against his right side and Mark's arm draped across his chest from the left. The previous night's memories flooded back, hands exploring unfamiliar bodies, whispered confessions, and pleasure unlike anything he had known before. He carefully slipped out from between them, watching as they unconsciously moved closer to each other in his absence. The sight stirred both tenderness and desire in him. He pulled on his pants and headed downstairs to make coffee. As water heated on the stove, James stared out the kitchen window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear blue sky and fallen branches across their yard. Just like the storm had changed their landscape, last night had transformed the emotional terrain between the 3 of them. The sound of footsteps made him turn, Mark stood in the doorway, wearing only jeans, his chest bare and hair disheveled. "Morning," Mark said cautiously, as if testing whether daylight had changed things between them. James smiled, relieved to find his feelings unchanged. "Coffee." They moved around the kitchen together, a comfortable silence between them. When their hands brushed reaching for mugs, neither pulled away. "About last night," Mark began. "I don't regret it," James said quickly. Mark's shoulders relaxed. "Neither do I," he leaned against the counter. "But it complicates everything." "Life was complicated the moment you showed up bleeding on our doorstep," James replied, but without resentment. They heard Lisa coming downstairs. She appeared wearing James's button-up shirt, her legs bare. She stopped when she saw them both looking at her, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Hi," she said softly. James handed her a coffee mug, kissing her forehead. "Sleep well." She nodded, leaning into his touch. "Better than I have in years." Her eyes moved to Mark, who watched them with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. She reached out her hand to him, which he took, completing their circle again. The moment of peace shattered when Mark's burner phone rang. His body instantly tensed as he answered it, listening intently. "When?" he asked, his voice hard. "How many?" After another pause, he said, "Keep them in sight but don't engage. I'll be in touch." He hung up and looked at James and Lisa, his expression grim. "They're here," he said, "Marshall's men. 3 of them checked into the motel on the edge of town last night." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. "How did they find you?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, but it was only a matter of time. James felt fear grip his chest, not just for himself, but for Lisa and Mark. "What do we do?" Mark ran a hand through his hair. "I need to leave. Now. Draw them away from you both." "No," Lisa said firmly, surprising them both. "We're in this together now." "She's right," James added. "We can help you fight this." He hesitated, then added, "I accessed my company's server yesterday. Downloaded shipping records that confirm illegal exports to those testing facilities. Dates, locations, signatures, everything you need." Mark stared at him. "You risked your job." "I risked more than that last night," James said with a small smile. "Seemed like the right thing to do." Lisa looked at her husband with new respect. "We can use my hospital credentials to access patient records from those trial facilities. Build a stronger case." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "Do you both understand what you're saying? These people won't hesitate to hurt you." James moved closer to Mark, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We understand, but running isn't the answer. We have a better chance together than apart," Lisa added, joining them. Mark looked between them, conflict clear on his face. Then his expression hardened with resolve. "All right, but we do this my way. And if things go south, you two get out, no matter what happens to me." The intensity in the room shifted from the intimate warmth of earlier to something equally powerful but more dangerous. James realized that the connection forged between them last night now made them stronger for the fight ahead. "First," Mark said, pulling out a map from his backpack, "we need to know exactly who we're dealing with." As they huddled around the kitchen table, working on their plan, James felt an unfamiliar but welcome feeling, that of being part of something bigger than himself, with 2 people he now realized he couldn't bear to lose. 3 months later, James stood on the deck of their new beach house, watching waves crash against the shore. The salty breeze carried away the last of his worries as he sipped his morning coffee. Behind him, the sliding glass door opened. Lisa stepped out, wrapped in a light robe, her hair longer now and lightened by the sun. "Beautiful day," she said, leaning against him as he put his arm around her. "Every day here is beautiful," James replied, kissing the top of her head. Their plan had worked better than any of them expected. Using James's shipping records and Lisa's medical connections, they had compiled irrefutable evidence of Marshall Pharmaceuticals' illegal activities. Mark had reached out to a trusted journalist friend who broke the story nationwide. Within days, federal investigations were launched, and several high-ranking officials were placed on leave pending investigation. The confrontation came the night before they planned to leave town. Marshall's men had broken into their home, but Mark was ready. Years of training had prepared him for this moment. With James's help, they subdued the intruders until authorities arrived. The men, facing serious charges themselves, quickly turned on their employers for reduced sentences. Mark appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with fresh fruit and bread. His face was more relaxed these days, the constant vigilance slowly fading from his eyes. "Breakfast is served," he announced, setting the tray on the small table. "I thought we could eat outside today." The three of them settled around the table, their movements around each other now fluid and natural. What had begun in crisis had evolved into something none of them had expected but all of them needed. "I got a call from my lawyer yesterday," Mark said, spreading jam on a piece of bread. "The last charges against me have been dropped. I'm officially a free man." Lisa reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "That's wonderful news." James felt relief wash over him. "So no more looking over our shoulders?" Mark shook his head. "Marshall is facing 20 years minimum. His associates are scrambling to make deals. It's over." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. With the danger gone, the question that had been lurking beneath the surface finally emerged. What happened now? James had resigned from his position, accepting a remote consulting job that paid less but gave him freedom. Lisa had transferred to a small local hospital, where her skills were desperately needed. But Mark had no obligations, no ties to this place they had chosen to start over. "I've been thinking," Mark said carefully, looking between them. "Now that this is all settled, I should figure out my next steps." Lisa's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "What are you thinking?" Mark took a deep breath. "There's a security consulting firm in the city that's interested in hiring me. Good position, good pay." James felt his heart sink. The city was 3 hours away. "That's a long commute," he said, trying to keep his voice light. Mark smiled slowly. "It would be if I was planning to commute." Lisa set down her mug. "What do you mean?" "I turned it down," Mark said. "Told them I was unavailable." James and Lisa exchanged glances, hope rising between them. "The thing is," Mark continued, looking out at the ocean, "I've spent most of my life running from things or chasing after them. For the first time, I want to stay put." His eyes returned to them. "If that's what you both want too." Lisa moved first, standing to wrap her arms around Mark's shoulders from behind. James joined them, completing the circle they had formed that stormy night months ago. "We want you to stay," James said simply. Later that evening, as the sun set over the water, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the three of them walked along the shore. Their hands linked together, feet sinking into wet sand. They had no map for the journey they were on, no examples to follow. Society might not understand what they had found together, but it didn't matter. James watched as Lisa laughed at something Mark said, her face glowing in the fading light. Mark caught James's eye and smiled, a silent understanding passing between them. What had begun with the shocking discovery of a wanted man hiding in their house had led them here, to a new home, a new life, and a love that defied easy definition but felt more real than anything James had ever known.